In the summer of 1945, long after the guns had stopped firing, another kind of story quietly unfolded behind the barbed wire fences of Britain's POW camps. This time, it was not about battles, weapons, or strategies. Instead, it was about something no one expected to survive the war: human hearts. And for many British soldiers, the most surprising chapter came when German women prisoners began forming deep emotional connections with the very men they once considered enemies. It started with small, barely noticeable moments. A group of German women, assigned to laundry and kitchen work, often encountered young British soldiers who supervised daily tasks. At first, the women avoided eye contact, keeping their heads low. They carried years of fear, shame, and propaganda that painted British men as cruel occupiers. The soldiers, on the other hand, were instructed to remain professional and distant. Yet, over time, something subtle began to change. A dropped bucket, a shared smile, a moment of unexpected help. These tiny interactions planted the earliest seeds of trust. One German prisoner, Elise, remembered the first time a British soldier helped her lift a heavy crate of supplies. She expected harshness, perhaps an order barked in a cold voice. Instead, the soldier simply said, "Let me help," with a gentle tone that shocked her. Acts of kindness like this slowly chipped away at the emotional walls built by years of war. Soon, the women noticed that many of the guards were not angry, hateful men, but young soldiers barely older than themselves, exhausted by war and longing for normalcy. The British found the women equally surprising. Instead of the fierce, frightening enemy their government had warned about, they saw frightened young women, many of them barely adults. They were thin, tired, and worried about their families in ruined cities back home. Some had lost everything: fathers at the front, homes in bombings, or brothers never heard from again. When British soldiers realized how vulnerable the women truly were, their attitudes softened. One of the earliest emotional bonds formed inside the camp's small library. A British soldier named Thomas, who loved reading, noticed that a German woman, Greta, always borrowed English books, despite barely understanding the language. Curious, he offered to help her translate. What began as short lessons turned into longer conversations about life, home, dreams, and fears. Other soldiers noticed how the two talked quietly in a corner each morning, sharing stories that transcended uniforms and nationalities. Soon, similar scenes began appearing throughout the camp. A guard sharing a cup of tea with a prisoner, a British medic tending to a German woman's injured hand with unexpected tenderness, a soldier teaching a POW how to pronounce English words. These interactions were small, but they carried emotional weight, far heavier than any regulation handbook could explain. It didn't take long for the camp officers to notice the growing warmth. Some turned a blind eye, believing compassion was better than cruelty. Others, however, worried that these rising friendships could break discipline. Officially, romantic involvement was forbidden. Unofficially, emotions didn't care about rules. And then came the truly shocking part. British citizens living near the camps started noticing strange things. They saw German women posts working in farms, helping in fields, and interacting with locals. The villagers were surprised by the women's politeness and work ethic. Slowly, suspicion faded. Some families even invited POWs to join them for Sunday tea, believing kindness was better than resentment. More surprising still, some British women wives and mothers encouraged their sons and brothers to treat the German women gently, reminding them that the war was over. In these moments, British soldiers and German women discovered something powerful: shared humanity. The war had tried to convince them they were enemies, but peace revealed a truth far deeper. They were simply people who had suffered in different ways. One of the most memorable stories involved a German nurse named Matilda and a British corporal named Henry. She had been captured while assisting injured civilians. He had survived brutal fighting in Normandy. Despite their painful pasts, they found comfort in talking during her medical duties in the camp infirmary. Henry later admitted that Matilda's calm voice helped him sleep without nightmares. For the first time in months, she, in turn, said that Henry's kindness reminded her of the brother she had lost in the war. They were not seeking romance, but comfort transformed into something deeper. Word of such emotional bonds spread quietly among the prisoners, becoming whispered topics in barracks after some women admitted they felt safer under British supervision than they ever had under Nazi officials. The British soldiers were shocked to hear this, but moved by the honesty. Inevitably, a few of these connections crossed the fragile line between friendship and affection. Secret exchanges of letters, short glances filled with meaning, small gifts of flour, a ribbon, a handwritten note. These gestures were risky, even dangerous. Discovery could lead to punishment for both sides. Yet hearts softened by trauma do not always follow orders. After months of gradual trust building, the camp atmosphere transformed. The British soldiers no longer saw German women as defeated enemies. The women no longer saw the British as looming threats. They became, instead, two groups of survivors trying to rebuild their shattered worlds. When repatriation finally began, many of the women were heartbroken. They had grown attached to the men who treated them with respect in a time of despair. Some left secretly folded notes behind, hoping the soldiers would find them. Others cried openly when boarding the trucks, waving goodbye to the guards. Turned something more. A few soldiers stood frozen, torn between duty and emotion. Many of these unexpected bonds never became public, lost to time and silence, but some endured. A handful of British soldiers later traveled to Germany, searching for the women whose kindness helped them heal, and in rare cases, they found them leading two marriages that astonished both nations. In the end, the shocking truth was simple. Even after a war as brutal as World War II, humanity found a way to break through, and in the most unlikely place, a POW camp, German women and British soldiers discovered that compassion could grow where hatred once lived. When the first winter after the war approached, the emotional atmosphere inside British POW camps reached an entirely new stage. No officer could have predicted by now the German women, prisoners, and the British soldiers had learned each other's routines, mannerisms, and vulnerabilities. The women knew which guards were strict, which were humorous, and which were quietly compassionate. The soldiers, in return, recognized which women were the most homesick, which carried hidden trauma, and which masked their fear with silence. This growing familiarity brought a strange but undeniable intimacy. The women began to feel safer around the British soldiers than at any time during the war. And the soldiers, after months of witnessing the women's resilience, found themselves deeply moved by their strength. Far from the propaganda-fed enemy image, they saw human beings who had been caught in a machine much bigger than themselves. One cold evening, the emotional breakthrough came unexpectedly. British soldiers were handing out blankets for the winter. A young guard named Peter noticed one woman, Sophia, shivering in silence, her thin POW coat unable to fight the freezing wind. He hesitated for a moment, then removed his own scarf and wrapped it gently around her shoulders. The look on Sophia's face was one of shock, not because of the gesture itself, but because she had never imagined a British soldier, a supposed enemy, offering her personal comfort. That single act spread across the camp like fire. Women whispered about it in the barracks, and soldiers mentioned it quietly among themselves. Trust deepened in ways no rulebook had prepared them for. The British officers became aware of this shifting emotional landscape. Surprisingly, many decided not to interfere. They believed kindness was more effective than control, and it showed discipline improved. Tension decreased, and cooperation became effortless. The women performed their duties willingly, often with pride, as if trying to return respect with respect. British soldiers admitted, sometimes reluctantly, that they no longer saw the women as prisoners at all. They saw them as survivors. During the holiday season, the emotional walls crumbled further. German women, who once expected cruelty, were stunned when British villagers invited them to a small Christmas gathering. It wasn't grand, just tea, warm soup, and homemade bread, but to the women, it felt like stepping into another world. Many confessed they hadn't felt a sense of home since before the war. A few broke down in tears, not from sadness, but from the shock of being treated like humans again. Some British soldiers accompanied the women to the village event, partly as escorts, partly as silent companions. That night changed everything. A soldier named Oliver ended up sitting next to a German prisoner named Lot. At first, they exchanged only polite words, but as the evening continued, they began sharing deeper stories. Oliver spoke about losing his brother in France. Lot revealed how her family survived repeated bombings in Berlin. By the end of the night, they were no longer talking as soldier and prisoner. They were two wounded people, seeking emotional shelter in each other. These new bonds did not go unnoticed. Friends teased each other quietly. Some older British sergeants shook their heads in disbelief, whispering, "War ends, but the heart doesn't listen to orders." Still, as long as discipline remained intact, the officers allowed these fragile connections to exist in the background. The most surprising transformation occurred in the camp's small medical hut. German women nurses, once terrified they would be mistreated, now worked side by side with British medics. They cleaned wounds, assisted in stitching injuries, and rewrapped bandages with careful hands. One British medic confessed privately that he had never seen such dedication. "They work," he said, "as if healing others is their way of healing themselves." One evening, a German nurse named Clara stayed late to tend to a wounded British soldier who had injured his leg in an accident. She sat by his bedside long after she was relieved of duty, refusing to leave until his fever dropped. When he awoke and saw her still there, he asked softly, "Why did you stay?" Her answer surprised him. "Because someone must stay, and I know what it feels like when no one does." Moments like this blurred lines no one dared to acknowledge openly. Soldiers found themselves thinking about the women after their shifts ended. The women, in turn, found comfort in seeing familiar faces of guards who had once intimidated them. In that moment, the war felt truly over, not because treaties were signed, but because compassion had conquered hatred. And although history rarely records such fragile human stories, the memories lived on in the hearts of the people who experienced them. The quiet romances, the unspoken attachments, and the healing connections formed in those camps became one of the most unexpected legacies of World War II.